You in the back want to come forward? There's lots of it reminds me of my class. Thank you for coming. I had thought I would write out a very careful speech. I heard a lot.
A little louder.
I had thought I would write a careful, beautiful speech, but I did not. I'm Andy Ruina. I am Jack's son. Also here are my two sisters, Ellen and Rachel. Maybe you should just show yourselves so people recognize them. And all of our spouses and kids are here, all the two. First, thanks for coming. What's the plan today is I will chatter for a few minutes, and then I will give the microphone to a few people who I know want to talk, and then after that, anybody who wants can talk. Is it distracting to have this on when people are giving a... All those in favor of leaving the pictures on? All those opposed to leaving the pictures on? Yeah, I got it. And then we'll have lunch, and the whole thing is starting late, so we'll go a little late. This part will maybe be about an hour, and I hope people tell various stories. So there are various reasons to be here. This is not a religious ceremony. I think very few of the people who are sitting here are religious. So I don't think of this as a funeral. And I also don't think of it as a celebration of life, but rather just a remembrance. I have a friend who died recently, and the greatest thing about the experience was hearing from all people from all different parts of her life, and learning about her, things that each of us learned about her, things we didn't know, and it would be nice if we could have that today. People tend to play up people who are dead, and I can imagine my father saying, I wrote it down, this does not apply to him, but I can imagine him saying, that guy was a horse's ass. And now everyone was pretending he was a great guy. So my father thought lots of people were horse's asses. But I don't see anybody here who are. Anyway, I hope we get the best picture we can. And by best, I mean deepest by what people say here. Let me just start with a little news about, people don't know how he died, I think, so let me just describe it. Probably people are curious, and I've been talking about it at the time. Our mother died 9 years ago, and near her death, she said his memory is slipping, and we hadn't really noticed that. And then within a few years, we did, and more or less tricked him into moving into assisted living in Washington, D.C., where he lived for the past 5 or so years. And his memory just gradually declined. His spirits, I think, were always good in that time period, maybe better on average than ever when we knew him before. And he just slipped more and more. At the end, he could recognize all of us and even our kids, and he could tell stories about when he was a young child, and he could not, if you asked him, what was your job? What did you do for a living? He didn't know that. And then he, without being sick at all, as far as we know, he died in his sleep from a stroke. So he slipped out kind of the most gentle, gradual way one could possibly do that. My main feeling is about sort of the passage of time and death. There's two things I feel like. It's easy to say time passes and we all die, but somehow I have not made peace with that. And this just makes me aware of those things. also just the feeling that everything falls apart. Somebody, one of the people here said, "It will be so nice to see you, Andy. This will be the last time we see each other." And that's probably true for many of the people here, and it's probably true for many of you to each other. And these are kind of occasions where you just become aware of your mortality and everybody's mortality and passage of time. And this, speaking of things falling apart, when my father was in college, he had a job in a library or something, but part of the job was managing a little recording booth. And he snuck into the booth one time with some friends and recorded a Bach fugue. And he gave me that recording, a little 78, when I was in high school. And more or less since then, I've been planning on this occasion, which I knew would come someday, to play that recording. And I remember a whole sequence of drawers and suitcases that record is in, and I can't find it. It's not, it's horrible. But anyway, Ellen, maybe you don't want to do this. But the recording goes like this. It's like four 18 or 20-year-old guys, and they're going, ba 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 ba. And then the second part comes in the same, and the other part goes ba 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 da ba ba da da ba da da ba da 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 da, and they all burst into laughter, and they can't sing anymore. And then he goes, "This has been Jack Ruina, Ben Gold," and I don't remember the other people. And I probably last heard that 30 years ago, and I still remember how that goes. Similarly, when I was in 5th grade, he went to Antarctica and brought back two special things. His Antarctica jacket, a super, super warm jacket. It's a USA Observer. I lent that to a girlfriend once who got into a fight with her roommate who threw away the jacket. He brought back a biscuit from Scott's expedition of 1912. And I've seen recently that you can buy those biscuits for about $1,000 each. Once in high school, I couldn't find any cookies in the house. And I went into his top drawer and pulled out that biscuit. He was 60 years old and ate it. Okay, some memories. My first memory is when he was 34 and I was 4 years old, and we lived in Champaign, Illinois, and Ellen will remember this, and Martin will probably remember this, and he took us into the backyard at night, I imagine it was cold, and looked up, and one of the stars was moving just a little bit, and that was Sputnik, the first satellite. It was the first thing I remember of him. When he was older, this was not so much true. When he was young, he was a very affectionate person. He would have us climb on him, have us lie on the floor with him. He loved listening to classical music, and he would lie with his arms spread out. He would listen to music with him. He hated animals, but he had a soft spot every now and then for one animal. So we had a dog that at Champaign named Spot, and somehow he seemed to really like Spot. On the music, you just heard Paul Robeson. I would say you could say he was a racist, or nearly a racist. He would get in arguments. For example, an argument I probably heard 5 times was his defending William Shockley. Maybe it's possible that people of different races having different genetics and different intelligence. And maybe some of you here had that argument with him. But separate from that kind of racism, he loved Paul Robeson. And I remember many times he's telling stories about what a wonderful person, a tragic person Paul Robeson was. He sang songs a lot when we were younger. Last year, I started looking up Paul Robeson, and I found a Paul Robeson album, and it was all the songs we heard. So I figured out he must have had that Paul Robeson record. We never had it. Rachel then found out from our Uncle Marvin that when he and Phyllis and Harold, Jack, who's my mother's sister and her husband, lived in an apartment next to each other. They were always listening to Paul Robeson records. So we grew up with this Paul Robeson record that we never heard until this year. And we have it on the tape here. One of the great things about him is that he was full of common sense. He was trained as an engineer, but I think he stopped being an engineer when he was about 30 years old. I think he identified mostly with physicists, not engineers. I think he mostly looked down on engineers, especially mechanical engineers, which I am. And I think he looked up to and considered himself sort of part of the community of physicists, not because he knew any modern physics, but because of this way of thinking of physicists, of understanding everything, having, I guess there's an expression, male answers disease. He had male answers disease, which is the disease that men have, physicists have especially, knowing the answer to every question, whether they do or do not. But he was full of common sense and liking puzzles and so on. An example, just I remember sort of things that delighted him were like doing house wiring projects and something doesn't add up. Something's connected to something else, but something else is not connected to something else, and then you start thinking, and then you figure out, well, it must be that somebody forgot to connect the ground wire in this box, and you go in and find that. Or another puzzle I remember is we had a vacation house in New Hampshire, and in the winter we turned down the heat, but leave the refrigerator on. And we came up once, and the house was all cold, and everything was melted in the freezer. But the freezer was on. So why would it be that when the house got cold, everything would melt in the freezer? And this was, he loved that puzzle. And you know, there's a simple answer. Who knows the answer besides the government? You were there for that? No. This happened to you, you know the experience. Anyway, the thermostat's in the refrigerator. So when the house gets below refrigerator temperature, then the whole freezer and refrigerator go off. And that's why when the house gets cold, everything melts. Anyway, he loved puzzles like that. On the other hand, maybe 7 years ago, I heard a puzzle that I thought was a great puzzle. It's called the two-envelope problem. I offer you two envelopes, and I tell you one of them has twice as much money as the other. You pick one, you look at it, and I offer to trade envelopes. It's a great puzzle. And I tried to talk about it with him because he was great to talk to about. It's an interesting, who knows that puzzle? Okay, it's a good puzzle, right? It's deep, and you know, it's got layers to it. Like the answer to the question isn't which envelope you pick. The answer to the question is why are there two different ways to calculate it, and you get a different answer each way. And he was confused. And Saskia, my wife, said, you were just being mean to him, having an argument with him. And so I guess that's when I lost him, when I couldn't have arguments and discussions about things like that. Another thing about him, just about his character, is that although he was extremely critical, in critical times he was incredibly supportive. And probably many of you have stories about him really going beyond what was necessary to do nice things at difficult times. And I think some people maybe have trouble appreciating him because of his being critical, but when you were really stuck and in trouble, he would drive hours and hours and do incredibly supportive things. It'll sound like a silly thing, but I remember when I was trying to choose graduate schools, he drove down from Boston to Providence and just spent 4 hours with me listing all the pluses and minuses, and in a very non-judgmental way, saying, well, do you like that? Is that important to you? How important is this compared to that? And I think his specialty was sort of applying common sense to decision making. It's a little anecdote from last night. Is we watched the final episode of Walter Cronkite, 1981. It's an interview with him about the Vela satellite. So one thing is, there are a few experts in the Vela satellite here today, and I would like to find out what the real story is. Anyway, in this story, he had the job with some other people, Dick was involved, and probably the only one directly involved, to decide whether South Africa or Israel had made an atomic test when some flash of light hit some satellite. And I guess everybody then and now thinks that they did make such a test, and he said they did not. But he said he's being interviewed. It was a very antagonistic interview, and he sounds very rational. But what I hear is this very testy person, and the person saying, "Well, the National Security Agency concluded that there was an atomic test." And he said, "You should be careful what you're saying. Some people at the agency said that there was an atomic test." And they said, "Well, so-and-so said." But he said, "Well, different people have different opinions." And I could almost hear him say next, "Well, they might say there's a man on the moon. That doesn't mean there is a man on the moon." And if it was a dinner party conversation, it would get more and more bitter, more and more sarcastic, more and more reductio ad absurdum, just defending his point, which is that in their study, the way it looked to them, and I assume they were being honest, that was more likely from the data they had, and they didn't know if or whether data was withheld from them, that it was more likely not an atomic test. Anyway, Dick probably can tell. It's maybe not relevant to the crowd, but I'm wondering what the end of the story is from an expert.
I'll say a couple of words.
Okay, so just as far as doing this in a little systematic way, there are a few people who I know want to talk, and I'll start there, and then we'll just pass the microphone around. And I think it's easiest if people just stay in their seats and talk. And then if people could introduce themselves in their relationship to my father when they're speaking, that would be good. So I wanted to start with Martin. Okay. So from my point of view, Martin is actually my father's son more than I am. That's probably true.
I'll take that as a great compliment. It's only the way you introduced him that I just sort of joke. I'm always chastised for saying, "Oh, Joe."
It's better if you. Let's have people come to the front if they can, so make it easier.
And speak directly into the microphone.
You got it.
As a means of support.
Every time I decide I'm going to tell this joke, especially my wife tells me that it's not fitting, it doesn't belong in that situation. Since Andy's talk, now I think this may be a fitting situation. It's about this elderly Jewish couple who have a German Shepherd, and the husband is madly in love with this dog. He died for this dog, and the dog dies. And so he goes around from temple to temple, trying to find a rabbi who would do the service for his dog. And he finally finds a little, I'm from Brooklyn, a little steeple somewhere, and he offers the rabbi $10,000 to do a service for the dog. Sure, the service comes, and the gentleman is sitting in the front row, and the rabbi gives this phenomenal speech. And during the whole speech, the elderly gentleman is crying and crying and crying. Finally, at the end of the sermon, the rabbi goes over and says, "I did just what you said. Why are you crying?" He said, "To tell you the truth, Rabbi, I never knew my dog did so much for the state of Israel." Why he had an opportunity to tell them. I'm Martin Alexander, and I am Jack and Edith's nephew. And as I go on with the talk, you'll see how I'm a little bit more connected than being a nephew. It's a great honor for me to come and talk now at this ceremony. From what you heard from Andy and my recollection of Jack is he truly was one of the smartest men I ever knew. He would, of course, challenge everything that I said and get into every argument that he could possibly do. But it didn't matter what I knew or didn't know, it didn't matter what I just read or didn't read. He knew more than I did about it. And for real, he thought so and he was right. Jack was the youngest of 9 children. My mother was the oldest. And we lived in Brooklyn. And I went to Brooklyn College for a year. And after that year at Brooklyn College, Jack and Edith thought I could get a more worldly and better education if I came to live with them in Champaign-Urbana at the University of Illinois. And so I did. I moved in with the Ruinas, which was a phenomenal experience. And I picked out some memories, and it's very difficult because there are so many memories, but I just want to tell you some of the things that I remember that stand out. Jack was very frugal among other things. But I wrote notes here, I don't even need them. The house they lived in was about 3 miles from the university. And it was a small house that like a colonial, but tiny. And in the back of the house was an added room that had 3 walls exposed to the outside. Now, you remember about turning the temperature off in New Hampshire. Well, Jack turned the temperature off in Illinois too, while we're all living there. So I slept in that back room, which got to be, I remember, it's below 0. I truly remember mornings waking up where my hand was leaning against the wall, and it was frozen to the wall. I couldn't get my hand off. And I would tell Jack, can we just put like a heater in here, something? I gotta get tough. It's too soft for you. You have to get tough. I used to bike to class. I lived with them. We lived about 3 miles from the university, and I'd bike to class. Being who Jack was, he thought it was cool for me to bike to class because even in the snows, I'd bike to class. He was always insist that he's going to drive me to class. In all my years at the university, I never once was on time. But he almost always promised, we'll get there, we'll get there. Andy alluded to the dog Spot. And I remember Spot very well. I have no idea how Spot got into the family. But Spot was like a 50-pound dog, dark, and had a big spot on his chest. Automatically, he was named Spot. And the family kind of ignored Spot, but Spot lived with us, and he'd eat the food from the table. And then we suddenly realized that Spot only lived with us part-time. And Spot would disappear. And then he would come back and stay with us again for a couple of weeks, and he'd disappear. So finally, Jack insisted we follow Spot. So I remember getting in a car like idiots. We're riding all over Champaign-Urbana, following the dog. And it turned out that Spot lived in another home. And they too thought that was their dog. They couldn't understand why the dog wasn't there all the time. I had this thing, he knew, I don't know how well you knew, everyone knows him, he knew everything about everything, or he thought he did. And he had this strange interest in compost. We had a piece of land, I remember it was about the size of this page, but we always were collecting compost. And we would go out at night, when it was dark, and steal other people's old leaves. And I remember at night going out with a rake so no one would see, and we'd collect leaves to build a compost pile. I'm going to skip some things. But
Don't skip any.
the highlight, one of the things I truly remember, is Jack took it upon himself for Sunday breakfasts. And Sunday breakfast entailed pancakes. It was always pancakes. But you never knew what went into those pancakes. Because he'd go to the refrigerator, and whatever was left went into the blender. So we had hamburger meat, pieces of ham, a cherry, a grape, dog food, everything went into that blender, and then we had pancakes. For the serious part, I actually molded my life based on Jack. He was always my idol. And everything I did as a child, I remember thinking, what would Jack do? And I tried to, throughout my life, do what I thought he would think to do, or what he did. The act of kindness that Jack and Edith did, taking me out of Brooklyn, changed my entire life. And I owe everything to them. because I have no idea what I would have done. But because of Jack's, I think, brilliance to me, I found out that he knew more and more about things that I thought I knew about. And so I thought I'd better change my profession. I was going to be an engineer, physicist. I thought there's no way I can match him in any way. I have to do something else. And with their help, they got me into a graduate course at the University of Illinois in virology, given by Salvatore Luria, who went on to then win a Nobel Prize. And that course then changed my life, and I ended up going into medicine, which I guess he would have a lot to say about that. You know, idiot. Jack taught me how to drive, and he taught me the most efficient way to tie my shoes. He had an answer for everything. I learned these minuscule things about bugs and about trees, and never mind physics and mathematics. I come to him with problems in math, and I was taking kind of advanced calculus. I thought I was a pretty smart guy. And I would forget the formula, and I didn't know the formula, and I'd ask him for help, and he never knew the formula. He'd sit down and derive it from the beginning to the end, and at the end came out with the formula that I was looking for. I really thought he was a genius. He is, when I went over these, I didn't even read what I wrote. When I went over these and brought back all these memories, I had to laugh and I had to cry. To me, it's the greatest loss I could think of. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Where's George? George? Okay, so we're not going to bring George up here, so we have to turn around to listen to George.
I'll try to pick up.
Say who you are.
I'm George Raskin. I thought I was a fellow who knew Jack best during the period we worked together.
Closer to the mic, George.
Jack was the director of the National Research ARPA, National Research Projects Agency. I came there about the time he did, and I was as chief scientist. Very quickly, he didn't need a chief scientist. He was one himself. And the fellow who had been his deputy eased his way out. And so I became Jack's deputy. And until the time when he began to have memory problems, I worked with him nearly every day, except occasionally when we were set off on special missions. One of them, for example, was when he was sent to the Antarctic to verify that he dealt mainly with the Russians there, and to find out what they were up to. He took comic books with him, and I guess had a pretty good time. But I was sent to South America the same day. And my problem was to deal with the Chileans and the Argentinians who were having troubles. And later on, he went up north again to Greenland, and I went south again. So he covered the world, and I covered it a lot more extensively than he did. He liked to walk. He did. I liked to climb, ski, play squash especially. So when we became intellectual activity, we were perfect matches. When a technical problem came up, he didn't have to tell me what to do, and I didn't have to tell him what to do. We just knew it. And so we worked together wonderfully for a very long time. And I would say that he was one of the two people in my life who most determined who I am. The other turned out to be George Kistikowski. No two people could be more different than they. Jack went through one wife. I had only one wife. Kistik managed three. one of the fellow student of mine at Berkeley. And he had a vicious temper. When things upset him, he let you know it. Nevertheless, the two of them, the two people who influenced the emotion and all I ever did, I found him the easiest going person I ever worked with. We never disagreed on a single item, to my knowledge at all, except in athletics. He was not a great athlete. I wasn't either, but I kept at it persistently. It was a pleasure all the way. I got to know Andy pretty well, followed his career, and I used to call him occasionally to find out if it was proper to try to talk to Jack. Increasingly over the years, he said, no, it won't do. You just can't get to. He's lost it in terms of short-term memory, pretty good on long-term memory. Go back 20 years, he can remember things. Go back 20 days, that would be beyond him. 2 hours sometimes, beyond. But he was one of the two great men that had an important thing in my life. I won't say that one's more important than the other, different, but nobody else has had a big influence on me as those two men. I was intending to speak here earlier. It took a long time for me to get here today. And I had thought to keep my remarks limited to about 3 or 4 minutes. I think I've used them up. And so I'll say no more. But I think he was a very great man. Great man that lived with. He lived with me for a while. And he was moving between houses. I went to his summer house in Cape Cod many times. It was altogether a great delight. And I'm glad he had the easy about did not suffer, and many of the rest of us have and will. That's enough said. Thank you all.
Dick, do you want to go up front, or you?
No, I'll go.
I'm Dick Garwin. My wife Lois and I knew Jack and Edith well. I mostly from Washington because I was with the President's Science Advisory Committee in the McNamara administration and McNamara's Secretary of Defense. And Jack was head of strategic programs, I guess, in DD&E. So we dealt with one another professionally. But I worked closely with him also with the Cambridge River crowd, with people at MIT and Harvard who were really interested in public policy and arms control. So 10 years ago, Jack had a recorded interview with Edith, and he recounted what he thought was his most important achievement. So I'm going to tell you about that. This was in the context of the so-called Soviet American Disarmament Studies Group that was headed on our side by Paul Doty, a biochemist of Harvard University. And a number of, maybe 6 or 8 of us were members, Jerry Wiesner, Marshall Schulman at times, other people. And we would talk with the Soviet scientists first on the borders of the Pugwash meetings. Pugwash was an international volunteer organization formed in 1958 following the Russell-Einstein Manifesto in 1955 to change our way of thinking about nuclear weapons, or else we would all be destroyed by them. Well, one of the problems with nuclear weapons is that things are not always what they seem. Yes, they are incredibly destructive. Yes, we had, the United States in 1967 had 35,000 of these things, And the Soviets had 45,000 about 15 years later. But the question was, build defense against nuclear weapons. And we did have defenses against bombers that would deliver nuclear weapons from the Soviet Union. You may remember them. There are a lot of them around here. But to build a defense against the missiles the Soviet Union was designing, and that was the question. So it was very contentious. People looked into it, decided, really paradoxically, that it wouldn't be a good idea, that the people who would build the defenses would have one view of their effectiveness, the people who would have the offensive missiles with nuclear weapons would have a different view. It would be terribly destabilizing, and the defenses could too readily be overcome. So it was Jack's job, he was the point person in this Soviet American Disarmament Studies group, to persuade the Soviet scientists and their leaders that building a defense against ballistic missiles was a bad idea. And everybody on the other side, from the top down, said that's ridiculous. Offense is bad, defense is good. And it took really a year or more of discussion for Jack to persuade at least a couple people on the Soviet side, who then explained to their leaders, and that's what brought us eventually the 1972 ABM treaty signed by President Nixon that banned defenses against ballistic missiles. Now, of course, the first thing that the George W. Bush administration did in 2001 was to walk out of the ABM treaty. It was a very bad idea. Anyhow. So Jack was a great man. He was persistent. He was not always on time for meetings. He was, Paul Doty would barely get onto an airplane because he was going with Jack. And it was a bone of contention. Yes, Jack headed for the Carter administration, for President Carter, for Frank Bresch, who was Jimmy Carter's science advisor, a review of the 1979 Vega flash. And the reason that's said to be a South Atlantic nuclear explosion is that there were other means of observing every other place on Earth except this little spot in the South Atlantic, Southeast Atlantic. So this satellite had a light signal that came on in 2 channels, and I was actually one of 3 people who was called in by the Director of Central Intelligence the day after to opine on whether it was a nuclear weapon test. But the White House did a proper review, of which I was a member, and Jack Ruina was chair months later. And all the technical evidence is that it was not. And yet, a lot of people in Washington, including intelligence agencies, think it was. But so far as I can see, they're wrong. Not a bit of evidence has come to light in all of the years since 1979 from anybody who was involved that it was a nuclear explosion by anybody. And so Jack did a good job. I can understand his frustration at being challenged on this. There were a lot of things that he couldn't say in support of his position. So it was great to work with him. He was a great friend as well as a major contributor to our national security. Thank you.
One person I wanted to pick on who who's maybe not prepared, but where is Stasha? Are you willing or able to say something? No. Well, she would have said something even interesting.
It's too much to say.
You don't want to say a little bit?
No.
Why don't we just start and just work back this direction? And Seymour? Okay. Jack? No pressure.
Andy, help him raise their hand if they want to speak.
As I look in your direction, give me a signal that you would like to speak. Okay.
3 people in this room. Can you come forward? If you're able, come forward. My name is Christina Wadsworth, and I grew up at 31 Hawthorne Street across from Rachel. And so I knew Mr. Ruina as a little girl, not in an academic sense in any way. And I spent many wonderful weeks in New Hampshire. And I just want to leave you with a completely different perspective of Mr. Ruina. He always enjoyed having us engage in work in New Hampshire before we got to play. And one day, Rachel and I were in the field cleaning the field of some noxious weed, and I heard a mooing sound, and I turned around and it was Mr. Ruina bending over new milkweed growth and biting it and chewing it. Somebody later told me that that's toxic, and I can't believe it because he was eating it. We later had it for dinner. But I wanted to leave you guys with that thought because he was always an incredibly affectionate, warm, and playful person in my life. And I'm very grateful for that.
I did not prepare to say anything, but I'm moved by all this. I came to America as an 8-year-old as a refugee from Germany, and my wife came from Greece as a 2-year-old into America. And the story of Jack coming here as a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old from Poland, being the 9th in the family and growing up in Brooklyn, and reaching the pinnacle that all of you are describing is, I think, a sensational story. And with all the problems we have in this country today, it shows us how great America is, that someone like that can achieve what all of you are familiar with and talking about. My little story is just one small part of Jack's history. I was director of real estate at MIT, and in the mid-60s, Jim Killian, the chairman of MIT, called me and said, we're having trouble attracting people from California and elsewhere to be professors at MIT because everything is fine. They love it here, they love our program, they love the courses and everything else. But when their families come to look at where they might be able to live, they immediately give up and go back to Palo Alto or Los Angeles. And so would you please, Tony, he said, find some houses we can offer these fellows. So I went into action as the new director of real estate and tried to find houses in Cambridge, which any of you who live here know are very hard to find and extremely expensive, and bought about a half a dozen for the Institute to keep on supply for these visiting gurus so that they might be attracted to come here. And one day around 65 or 66, this gentleman wandered into my office, which was right next door to this building, which didn't exist at that time, and said, can you help me find a house? And so I went into our little inventory of half a dozen and found one that I thought would make sense to him after I heard about it, which was on Hawthorne Street, the lady before just mentioned being a neighbor. And so I took Jack to the house, and he decided, yes, this was where I'd like to live. And then we went ahead and we made a deal where I was selling to the Ruina family the house that was owned by MIT. And we had a theoretical problem at MIT at that time because, as ever, there was constant speculation in the housing market in Cambridge, where people became famous for making fortunes by selling their houses at the top of the market. This was in the mid-60s. nothing has changed 50 years later. And so we decided, MIT decided, we had to put into the agreements for the sale by MIT to a faculty member some kind of provision that would prevent that faculty member from making a fortune years later when he sold the property in order to go to some competing institution. And I went to Paul Samuelson, the first Nobel laureate in economics, who was an American, and asked him if he could help me structure a formula to provide a fair basis for this arrangement. And the result was, after a lot of work, that we figured out some kind of a cost of living escalation clause, which would be slower than the real estate speculation rate of increase. And that was the formula that I put into the agreement with Jack. And Jack and I spent quite a bit of time negotiating this, where he finally, after weeks, agreed to whatever it was, I can't remember. And we happened at that time to be working with a contractor to remodel the house. And I can't remember whether we undertook that or he undertook that. But the contractor was a woman, and it was quite unusual in the 60s for a woman to be doing house construction. So there were all sorts of problems with this quite aggressive woman who had to do things her way and charge her prices, et cetera, et cetera. But all that was resolved finally. And I think the Ruinas then had a very nice time in that house until later on when they eventually left. I was always impressed by both Jack and Edith as just outstanding individuals. I don't know much about his professional work, but we've heard about that. And all I can say is that from my perspective, we have a wonderful couple here. Thank you.
I think we have a, do I go up front?
My name is Prudence Steiner. I'm from that institution up the road. And I met Jack because of a friend of my parents named William Theodore Golden, Bill Golden, and some of you may know him. I represent the non-scientific side. Jack and I, thank you, that's better. Thanks for showing me. Jack and I would have lunch from time to time, thanks to our introduction from Bill Golden. And we would talk about, or I would listen to, conversations about everything that had nothing to do with science. Modern novels, movies, music. He and I agreed about Bach. I simply want to say that in addition to all of his extraordinary public contributions to the world, there was this other, less scientific, but equally significant range of knowledge, and I want to celebrate that. Thank you.
I had not intended to speak. My name is Jim Walsh, and I'm at the Security Studies program at MIT. I'm honored to be here and honored to sit at the table with my longtime mentor and supporter, George Rathjens. I just thought, I met Jack at a different point, in a different window, or a different moment in that arc of his career. And just wanted to remind you or share with you that not only was he accomplished in the natural sciences and worked for the federal government, he was also the first ever director of the Security Studies program at MIT. And as a consequence of his generosity, we have two big events each year. Two. And one of them is the Jack Ruina Nuclear Age speaker dinner series, where every year we bring in Hans Blix or a notable person to come in and talk about what continues to be one of the most important issues we confront in the national security business. But I don't want to talk about that, and so I really just want to take a minute and reflect on my personal time at MIT in the 1990s when I was an oldish grad student, 30-something, and it's 1992 or 1993. I don't know how many of my contemporaries are here to represent that period, so I'm going to do that. And I would say that there are two things that stuck out for me about that. One was the incredible friendship and working relationship between Jack and George. I've never seen anything like it. I don't know if I ever will see anything like it. It was tremendous. And second, for me, as a young graduate student, you don't really know what's coming later. You don't realize that you have such tremendous opportunity to play with ideas and to take hours and talk to your colleagues and to talk to people who are older and your mentors and to take the time to soak and poke and think. Not realizing that years later that the more you do, the more people ask of you and your inbox gets busy and you have to give talks, you have to get on a plane, you have to do all these things, but for that one brief period, or it's not that brief in my case, 6, 7 years. That one brief period, you get to relax and think and try to be creative. And there was one institution where that really happened within SSP. I mean, there were many, but for me, George and Jack hosted a working group, the New Directions and Security Studies working group, every other week or once a month, whatever it was. And we do it in the evening and they bring beer. People didn't do that then. I don't think you can do that now, actually, at MIT. I think there are a bunch of new rules. But they would buy beer for everyone and we'd have food and the students would present and you could do anything you wanted. Now, Jack may have thought he knew everything or maybe he did know everything, but he didn't know it in those meetings because he didn't speak up and say, no, you're wrong. Both George and Jack gave us the space to play with ideas, to be right, to be wrong. Maybe at the very end there might be a terse statement or an observation that would help people figure out that they have more work to do. But in the main, it was an incredibly gentle and supportive period that I'm sure all my colleagues look back on with fondness. So for me personally, and certainly for the Security Studies program, Jack was a singular figure with George, and we all miss him very much. Thank you.
You want to come forward?
My name is David Schwartz, and most of you knew Jack much better than I did. I was lucky enough to have him on my dissertation committee. Jack and George were the reasons I came to MIT in the first place. Just a couple of observations. First of all, to take off on something that Dick Garvey mentioned, and to disagree a little bit with George. Jack was actually a fine sprinter. And I learned this when I traveled with him, because he would always arrive, when I was with him at least, he would always arrive at the airport as the door was closing down the gangplank, and we would be tearing down the gangplank, screaming, hold the plane, and he was actually able at one point, and I don't think you can do this anymore, to persuade the ground staff to reopen the door that had been closed. And he was quite persuasive. At a certain point, you get tired of this, and I determined never to fly with him again. But the more important thing is that those of you who are MIT people know how special this place is. It's a unique institution, and very, very special for a lot of reasons. And the more I dealt with Jack, the more I came to think of him as epitomizing at least one aspect of why this place is special. And it wasn't simply that people like Jack and George treated the graduate students as peers. They did. But they treated the undergraduates as peers as well. There was a very easy and informal give and take, and a huge amount of respect that the faculty here showed, and I assume still shows, to the student body here. One day I sidled up to Jack and I said, because I thought of him as, Mr. MIT, and I said, Jack, so what is it about the students here, and what is it about the situation that causes you to treat students as peers? Where, at Stanford, that certainly was never the case. And I know most of the institutions I've been to, I've seen, it's just not the case. And he laughed, he said, when I'm sitting in front of a group of 100 students and talking, I know at least 30% of them are smarter than me. And he said that a few of them are going to be Nobel Prize winners, so why shouldn't we treat them as peers? And that to me was essential Jack. He was informal. He was a man who was passionate about facts and fact-based analysis. And it didn't matter if you were 20 or 30 or 40 or 50, he treated you the same way. Thank you.
My name is Annalise Cohen, and Jack and Edith were very dear friends, and the friendship was particularly alive in Wellfleet, where both of us had houses in summer, and where we were surrounded by children and grandchildren, and we did a great deal of visiting. And the generosity of Jack humanly towards no matter what your status was, what your education was, he would engage on any level with the greatest warmth, and it was a real joy to be with him. And we treasured the friendship, and at this point, Wellfleet is certainly not the same. And I could go into detail, but Jack, we were lucky to have had you. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Judy Eskins. I'm a niece on Edith's side. I spent many weeks and months living at the Ruinas. What's the signal?
Spread it to your mouth.
Oh, okay. Both as a child, when our parents went on vacation, my mother and Edith were sisters, and we would spend a lot of time at the Ruinas. And I remember certain silly things, I guess, but one is that Jack used to like to trick Ellen, although maybe she knew the trick. He would always put an egg, when he would make us milkshakes. He would offer this great treat of milkshakes, and he would sneak eggs into it because Ellen refused to eat eggs. And I always, on the one hand, I thought, wow, this is kind of cool that I'm in on this secret. But on the other hand, I think it was sort of a revelation to me that parents would actually try to trick their children. Now I know, as a parent. But I also lived there both during college, when my parents were living in Europe and I had nowhere else to go during school vacations. And later on, at another point in life, when I was between boyfriends and between homes, I also found safe haven at their house. And Jack was always very, very kind and warm. I think I took it as kind of a personal goal to try to find something that I could say that he either didn't know or that he would recognize as a good point. And I have a vague memory that I did it. I don't know, maybe it was just a dream, or maybe he was being kind to me and sort of like giving up and just yielding the point, but I somehow think that maybe once or twice I managed to say something that he thought was important. Following on Martin's comments about the pancakes, I want to also mention that I think that pancake batter, or some of the same leftovers, went into the soup, because he did not cook a lot, but he was very proud of his soups, and they were always made of leftovers, and you never really knew what was in them, but they were usually surprisingly good. Another thing about living at the Ruina's house, Jack was very particular about how the dishwasher was loaded. And if you were a guest, and of course, as a guest at the Ruinas, you always had to chip in and take on your chores that were assigned from the moment you walked in the door. If you were trying to be helpful and loading the dishwasher, little did you know that after you went up to bed, Jack would come down to the kitchen, rearrange the dishwasher in the way that he thought was the proper arrangement of the dishes. Another kind of silly thing that I remember is my mother used to make a salad dressing that we all loved. We called it Russian dressing, and she would make it by mixing together ketchup and mayonnaise, which actually sounds kind of disgusting to me now, but as a kid, we thought this was great. However, Jack was horrified, and it was a rule in our house. We did not make Russian dressing if Jack was coming over, because he just thought this was like an abomination. So he had certain things that he was very particular about. Trash was one. There were very few places to put trash in the house because somehow they didn't believe in trash. I'm not sure where it went. I just lost my train of thought. There was another one I was going to mention, but trash. Trash, yeah. I don't know. I'll think of it. So I also just want to say for the people who, I mean, certainly Jack could be a very critical person, but his kindness, I think, was particularly in evidence in Edith's last years, where he was just an incredibly loving and devoted husband to her. Thank you.
My name is Richard Kahn, and I'm Jack's nephew. Okay. And I just don't have any, I have very few stories, actually only one to mention, because I knew my uncle not closely, not intimately. I stayed at their house a couple times, and I talked to them a few times, and he would ask me what I'm doing and so forth, and always challenge me as to what is going on in my life and what was really happening in the disease that I happened to be studying or working on. But the thing that actually struck me about him that I remember to this day, and I have the same sort of vehemence that he had, and it's reflected in a slide that came just before I walked up here, in which you saw a profile of his wearing earplugs. You remember that? And so to this day, I do remember that at weddings and bar mitzvahs, we would come in and sit down, and within about 30 minutes, he would just rant about the sound, the noise level of the band, and just go on and get very aggravated, very perturbed, and then you actually walk out and say, I just can't stand it, I'm gonna sit out there. And I just was first, when I heard this, I was just struck by it, well, this is a normal thing, everybody plays loud music, and even today you go to resorts and various islands, they're always playing music around the pool, and weddings and bar mitzvahs with loud music. And every time I hear that loud music, I think of him. And it actually gets to be annoying to me too now. He would do that all the time. And then I remember him actually pulling out earplugs. When the music, pardon?
I have the earplugs.
Okay. When the music started, and that's a memory that not only has lasted, but he infected me with the same sense of disgust. All over. So that's my contribution. Thank you.
I have to.
I'm Rachel, Ruina. I'm one of the daughters. First of all, if you'd like to stand up and just stretch for a minute, I'm going to invite everybody to do that because we've been sitting for a while. So everybody stand up and just stretch for a minute. Also, I think it's almost over. My father talked a lot about what a lucky person he was. He talked about how lucky he was to come to this country. He talked about how lucky he was to go to college. He talked about how lucky he was to meet my mother. And I'd like to take a minute, and as far as the going to college, I'd like to thank my cousins that are here, because if it weren't for their mothers and fathers, I think my father would not have been able to go to college. And he was always very, very grateful for that. My father was very generous with his time. People talked about how good he was at problem solving. There were problems that we had along the way that were sort of anxiety provoking and seemed insurmountable, and he had a way of sort of immediately like listening to your problems and then pulling you away and giving you this enormous sense of perspective. My family has heard these stories before, but when I was a kid, I remember going to him when I had trouble in school and asking for help. You know, there would be a test the next day and asking for help with the test. And my father would look at the textbook and say, after studying it for a few minutes, you know what, this is stupid. This is so stupid, don't waste your time doing it, let's go for a walk. And I would say, but Dad, I have the test tomorrow, I have to be prepared. And he would look at me and say, you know what, you're adorable, and you're gonna be fine, and just forget about it. My father was a conservationist. People have talked about leftovers and the things they found in the pancakes and his interest in compost piles, which actually grew deeper over time. He found out in Cape Cod there was a restaurant that had a compost pile, and they started to rely on him to come and pick up the compost, and they stopped their service that picked up the compost. And at first he would collect the compost and dump it somewhere, but then eventually he started inspecting the compost further and pulling things out of the compost that became the soup and the pancakes. My father's relationship with money, I think, was interesting in that he was very, very generous in many ways. It's incredible to me that he sent all of us to private high schools, and when it came time to go to college, he never talked about money as a factor. I think he sort of had his priorities straight in that way. He could also be a conservationist with money, and was very careful about how he spent money, particularly on things like transportation and food. In our family, we had a rule that we were never allowed to stay in more than one hotel room, no matter how many of us were in the hotel. So we had a procedure, which is we were supposed to all gather in the lobby and then one by one go up to the room so that nobody could see how many of us were staying in the hotel room. I wanted to show, my father had this t-shirt that he used to wear to bed, and I think he wore this t-shirt to bed like every single night for 30 years. And I just want to show it to you because he was perfectly happy with this t-shirt. Nobody has ever seen fabric like this. It used to say, it was from some chemical company, and it said, "I am a bead." And he wore this thing, well, I mean, I've never seen a more worn out t-shirt. It's like a shroud of Turin, that's exactly right. And the last little vignette I want to tell is our son, Kobe, who's here in the audience, had cancer when he was 12 and a bone marrow transplant and was in the hospital for almost a year. And my father came and he asked what he could do to help, which was absolutely in character. And he found out that the next day, my husband, who's a professor at Georgetown, had a class that he wasn't going to be able to go to because we had to be in the hospital. And my father insisted on looking and finding what the class was, and lo and behold, it was on arms control and disarmament. And he went and taught that class, and that was the last class he ever taught. Which is sort of appropriate, I think.
I'm Andy Bennett. I'm married to Rachel, so Jack's son-in-law. It's hard to say anything about such a long, productive life. I knew Jack for 30 years, and that was only a third of his life, really. And he, like any person, he was a series of paradoxes. So let me just speak to a few of those. A couple of people have mentioned, Rachel mentioned how he was careful with money. When he was older and in the retirement home, I've noticed when people get older, they become distilled versions of themselves. So you have to practice good habits when you're my age so that you become a distilled version of yourself. And he was, still himself, very much so. And at one point he had fallen and hurt his back. And I'd come over to the nursing home to help. And the staff had to move him around, and he was in terrible pain, but instead of saying, that really hurts, or I'm in pain, he was shouting, "It's expensive." I think, the neurons in his brain for pain and spending money, it was just one neuron. So that was how much of a and yet, at the same time, this is a guy who was the first of his family of that generation to go to college, and he saved, through all his carefulness with money, he saved enough money that all of his grandchildren have 529 accounts, all of them and their children too, I think, will be in good position to go to college. I mean, it was all the saving for his family, that's what all that carefulness with money has turned into. Second paradox is technology. I mean, he was an electrical engineer, right, at MIT. He hired one of the guys who invented the internet. I tell people that since Al Gore said he invented the internet and Bill Clinton hired Al Gore, some people think that makes my wife Rachel Bill Clinton's illegitimate love child. No, but he actually did hire one of the guys who invented the internet. And yet when it came to the internet or any technology, Jack was the most backward person I knew. And partly the generational thing, partly had a really complicated logon from MITRE and everything else. But he never really got the internet, but he was perfectly fine with the generation of technology of his day. And so he was really a formative influence on so many of us here, myself included. I'm kind of in the same field, roughly, but I learned more from him, I think, about being a father, about being a husband, than I did about arms control. I certainly learned a lot from him about that. So I hope my children and his other grandchildren will take away some of his perseverance, some of his willingness to try new things. The third paradox, people have mentioned how he could be opinionated, to put it mildly. He always had an opinion on things, but at the same time, he was extraordinarily open-minded. He would entertain any number of a range of points of view, even if they're quite different from his own. So I hope I have something else that my children will take away, as well as his tremendous generosity of spirit and with all of his family. Thank you.
Okay, I hadn't planned on speaking, but my name is Caroline, and I'm Jack's granddaughter. We call him Tapa, so I'll call him that. What I remember from him is a great amount of love. The way that he loved my grandmother was so inspiring, and he just sort of radiated sentimentality. Like, two of my favorite stories, I'll tell the first one, I think my mom told me, which was that he would read his children Charlotte's Web, and he would always cry at the part when Charlotte died. And I thought that was just the sweetest story I've ever heard. So there's that. And then when he met my grandma, who he loved so much, I mean, I tell my mom over and over, I'm not going to get married, but looking at my grandpa, he makes me believe in love and long-lasting marriage. He said that he met Moogie, my grandmother, and he decided immediately to marry her. And he said it was always I'm paraphrasing here, but the stupidest and best decision he ever made in his life. That, and I remember he would make these special milkshakes for us, which now I question what was in them. And that's all. I just wanted to tell my remembrances of my grandfather. Thank you.
My name is Marvin Miller. I joined MIT in the mid-70s and retired some years later, although I'm still have an affiliation. And I want to reflect on two things. One specifically about Jack, but the other more generally about my good fortune about being at MIT. As several of you have said already, it's a very stimulating place, and as I say, some people have already mentioned that. I'd like to mention the words of someone who was not here, who was at MIT as a student in the 1970s, and who I met as a student. His name is Ali Akbar Salahi. I met him, as I said, in the 70s. He got his PhD in nuclear engineering in 1977, back to Iran. And when I saw him several years ago at the Iranian mission to the UN, he greeted me warmly and said that his days at MIT were the best years of his life. Now, many people might have a mixed view of that because Salahi at that time was the foreign minister of Iran and now was head of their Atomic Energy Commission. Some people at least would say it was not a very good idea for MIT to educate people like that. I don't agree with that, but in any case, I share what Salahi said, his reverence for his days at MIT, and more specifically, when I came here, I met George Rathjens and Jack, and interacted with them over the next 25, 30 years, and was very stimulated by the interactions. But I'd like to sort of end with another aspect of Jack, which may not be as well appreciated here, his sense of humor. He was not traditionally religious, but given his background, he was very steeped, I would say, in Jewish humor. And occasionally we would get together and we would trade jokes. And I'd like to tell you one that he told me. It's a little off color, but perhaps I should say, I'll apologize in advance. The joke is that there's this Hasidic community in Brooklyn, and one of the members of the community has just gotten engaged to get married, and he goes to tell the Rebbe, the leader of the group, the good news. He's very excited, and this particular man loves to dance, and he says to the Rebbe, I'm getting married now. Will I be able to dance with my wife? And the Rebbe shakes his head and he said no. And the guy is devastated. He doesn't know what to say. And in a small voice, he says to the Rebbe, but I can have intercourse with my wife. And the Rebbe said, of course. And then he says, in all positions? And the Rebbe said, certainly. And then he says, does that include standing up? And the Rebbe shakes his head and says, no, that might lead to dance. So Jack was a multi-dimensional man, and I benefited from all of his dimensions. Thank you.
Just a little thing about Jewish. One of the paradoxes, I think it came from Bach, but he was extremely interested in Jesus in the New Testament. And I guess that came from Bach somehow. But like, I got an old Britannica, and you just open it up and wonder about Paul. Strange. Well, I think we go on to lunch. Supposedly we're going to kick out of here at 2. There's a buffet outside. I don't know how it's organized. There should be enough variety of food for everybody here, unless you like raw pork or something. You want to say something?
So who took these wonderful pictures?
The later ones are probably mostly me, and then the earlier ones are his camera, his great Contax camera, which he got from Korea. And just handed to somebody or other. They span the oldest picture we have of him, which is when he's 2 years old in Poland, and the most recent picture we have of him, which is in November when he told us that his Uncle Nathan had paid for the family to come to the United States.
Andy, there was a picture of him lying on his side. That was in his
Lying sort of with his back, it's in the assisted living. And it's not especially recent, that picture. It's not as sad as it looks. So I guess I'll turn on the lights, and we do not have assigned seating. Probably it's find the people you wanted to meet when you're here and sit with them.